So we'll kick off with tonight's talk on the birding in the Indian Ocean. Um,
Just
that's fine.
minimize this at the side.
Okay. So a little bit about us. We are from Northeast Wales. We have a passion for the natural world, and we're always on the hunt for a good local rare and scarce species. We wanted to. We do have a passion for following our recent trips around the world, especially with Hawaii last year. We really wanted to explore another part of the island groups. So the Seychelles has been on our mind for a little while, really, prior to COVID. So we thought, let's do it. And primarily, we thought, let's just go to the Seychelles. But we actually, with a little bit of research, looked into Reunion and Mauritius as well, and found that it was quite an easy way of doing all three in one, as we were in that part of the world. So as you can see, the orange pins there, the island group are the just east of Africa and the west side of the Indian Ocean. So the flights and the travel, we went during last summer, during July and August 2024, and we took a flight to Dubai from Manchester and then over to the Seychelles. It was quite straightforward. It was about 6 hours from Manchester to Dubai, and then another 4 or 5 hours from Dubai to Mahe, which is in the Seychelles. We then followed on straight through flights to Reunion and Mauritius. So the Seychelles we'll start with because that's where we went first. It's an archipelago of 115 islands to the northeast of Madagascar. And almost 50% of the Seychelles land mass is occupied by national parks. The Seychelles were uninhabited until about 1770 when they were colonized by the French. The population of the Seychelles was estimated to be about 105,000 people living there in 2024.
Yeah, very simple it
So,
is.
so here's a map really of the Seychelles. We visited Praslin first. We obviously flew to Mahe and then we got a ferry over to Praslin. From Praslin, it was easy to visit Cousin Island and Ledige Island, which we'll speak about in a little while. And we ended up visiting Mahe after that by getting the ferry back from Praslin. So after a taxi ride to the port, we immediately boarded the ferry to take us about 48 kilometres to Praslin. This was the biggest opportunity to see our target shearwaters. Wedge-tail shearwaters were a species that we had seen before. They were nesting in colonies in Hawaii last year. But over on the ferry crossing, we had about 100 of these over on the crossing. Tropical shearwaters, just in the top left of the corner. They remind me very much of Manx shearwaters that we get in the UK here. They're a little bit smaller, black and white, long rounded tail, relatively short wings, and we saw around about 10 of those on our crossing.
Okay, so Praslin Island, this was the first island that we properly visited. And I have to say, I think out of all the places we went for our trip, I think Praslin Island was my favourite. We stayed at a beautiful hotel in Bay St. Anne's, which was about 5 minutes away from the ferry terminal. So that was Chalet's Coatmare. That's on the southeast of the island. Praslin is famous for some incredible beaches, including one called Anselazio, which is actually rated as one of the most beautiful beaches in the world. It's in the top 10. And Praslin Island is actually one main road around the island in a sort of horseshoe shape, with like a second road cutting through the middle through the Coco de Mer plantation. So it's not a majorly built up island or anything like that. There's just one main road. And all the endemic birds on Praslin were actually very easy to see in just one day. So that's a great opportunity to combine the Seychelles with a family holiday. If you've got a partner that's not interested in birding and would like, a nice getaway, it's a really good trip to do that. Like I say, Chalet's Coatmare as well. There's a restaurant on site. And as you can see at the bottom left as well, there's a lot of granite rock beaches that the Seychelles are famous for. So the endemic bird species. Now, the Seychelles is recognised as an important bird area, and there are 14 surviving endemic land birds on the Seychelles. We saw all of the ones that can be found on the main island, so that's 12. There's two that aren't. That's the Aldabra drongo and the Aldabra fody, and they can only be found on the Aldabra atoll, which is part of the Seychelles, but is actually a lot closer to Madagascar than the rest of the island group in the Seychelles. So, 6 Seychelles endemics can be found on Praslin itself. First one of these is the Seychelles blue pigeon. They were quite secretive on Praslin. We found they were a lot more common and easier to see on Mahe, but we were lucky to see this nice individual here on the wires perching out in the open for us. Second one here is the Seychelles sunbird. Now, they were common across the island. We actually saw a lot of these feeding on nectar in the hotel gardens. They were zipping about everywhere and were quite a common bird on Praslin, so they were very easy to see as well. We've got here the Seychelles swiftlet over on the left. Now, they were seen in low numbers scattered across the island. There was no real main site for them on Praslin. They were just one of those birds that you kind of encounter as you're driving along. You'd see a swift sort of zipping across the road above you or around the trees as you're in a car park. There was no real site to kind of nail those on Praslin compared to Mahe. Here we've got the Seychelles bulbul. Again, they were seen across the island in low numbers. They were not particularly difficult to come across. Not the most attractive of bulbuls, but was still lovely to see as well. And then we have here the Seychelles kestrel. Now, that was actually rare and unexpected on Praslin Island. We were actually expecting to see that on Mahe, so it was quite a surprise to come across one. We actually came across this individual perched on some wires in one of the villages called Grand Anse. So Seychelles kestrels actually became extinct on Praslin in the 70s. They had a reintroduction project in 1977 where they did reintroduce a lot of birds, but this was not a success. And eventually those birds kind of just died out. And at the moment, there's only 4 breeding pairs of Seychelles kestrels on Praslin. So we were very lucky to come across this individual. And then the last endemic species on Praslin Island is a species that is actually only found on Praslin, and that is the Seychelles black parrot. We saw these birds at the Vallée de Mai Nature Reserve, and also we came across some birds feeding on these endemic palms at the village of Grand Anse. You can see there on the left, we spotted them perched on the wires. And the population of the Seychelles black parrot is thought to be around 1,000 birds on Praslin. So we got some really, really good views of these. They allowed quite a close approach as they were feeding on the palm fruits here. You can see the little red fruits that they're eating. So it was really nice to see these sort of up close and showing quite nicely. Now, I mentioned that we saw the Seychelles black parrot at a place called Vallée de Mai, which is a national park on Praslin. It's quite a famous place, and you can actually see 5 of the 6 Seychelles endemics here, and we actually saw them all in the car park. The only one that we didn't see was the Seychelles kestrel. You can see there on the left, that's the car park. There's a lot of trees, and like I say, we managed to see all of the 5 of those 6 endemics here in the car park. Guided tours of the park are available if that's something that you would like to do. That's not something that we did because obviously we were satisfied with everything that we saw in the car park. But it's also home of the largest seed in the world, which is this. It's the coco de mer nut. You can see it there on the left. It's actually the largest and heaviest nut seed in the world. It's quite an icon of the Seychelles, and it's endemic to the islands. And it actually only grows on Praslin Island itself and nearby Curious Island. As you can see here,
we were actually told at the time not to park underneath these parks.
Yes.
Because if one of those fell off the tree onto your car, you'd incur huge costs from the insurance company. So
it's not valid.
That was a little tip that we had as we were there, not to park under one.
Yeah, so you can see here, this is the Coco de Mer nut. They do have them for sale as well in the visitor centre. They have a lot of souvenirs, Coco de Mer souvenirs, if that's your sort of thing. You can see here on the bottom right as well, that's another interesting species we came across on Praslin. It's the Coco de Mer snail. Again, that's endemic to the Seychelles, and it actually only lives on the Coco de Mer trees, so it's quite specialized. And I did spend about 5 minutes going around all the leaves looking for one of these, so I was quite pleased to come across one. And in the top right as well, we did see a lot of geckos across the Seychelles while we were there. This one here is a Seychelles giant day gecko. So we came across quite a lot of these. They were in the hotel rooms, they were on the hotel walls, they were on outside, they were inside, they were everywhere. So there's a few other species as well that can be found on the Seychelles that aren't perhaps endemics. So just a few other species of note. We did come across a pair of yellow bitterns at a place called Lemuria Golf Course, and that is part of the Lemuria Resort. So the entrance there is gated, but visitors are allowed in if you are visiting the nearby beach on the northern shores. So this was a pair of birds that Alex actually found on the pond there that you can see on the right in the clubhouse. These were the only birds that we had during the entire trip of yellow bitten. They are quite uncommon on the Seychelles, so it was quite a good bird that we were pleased to get under our belt quite early on, actually. Some other species that can be found on Praslin Island, they are introduced, so they're not native to the Seychelles, but they were new birds to us as well. So on the right here, we've got the red fody. Now that is common across all of the Seychelles. It is introduced from Madagascar. And on the left, we have the Malagasy turtle dove. Again, that is introduced from Madagascar and is common all over the Seychelles. There are a lot of white-tailed tropic birds as well that we saw on Praslin. Again, they were common across the island. They were kind of the equivalent of seagulls over there. So they don't have any gulls on the Seychelles, but whenever we were by the sea, tropic birds would be going by, and we would often see them going inland as well to their nests in the more forested areas. Another species that was quite interesting that isn't particularly, bird related, but is lovely to see was the Seychelles flying fox. So that is a bat species that is endemic to the Seychelles. It was common across the island, and we often saw it throughout the day. We saw them where we were staying at Chalet's Côte Mer. They were feeding on the fruits in the trees by the car park, and they are actually a significant component of the Seychelles ecosystem, because they do disperse seeds of many of the native tree species, being a fruit eater. So it was quite surreal to see these giant bats, flying overhead. It was quite nice to see. So while we were on Praslin Island, we went to a place called Cousin Island, which is a small island about 2 kilometers off the west coast of Praslin. We booked this via a company called Angel Tours. It's open to the public in the morning only, but you have to do a guided tour around there. So there are 3 endemic species found on Cousin Island, which we went to go and see, and it is an important seabird breeding location. One thing I would say about Cousin Island as well is that if you do go to the Seychelles and you do go to Cousin Island, make sure that you wear long sleeve shirts and long trousers, because I've never seen as many mosquitoes in my life as there were on Cousin Island. So absolutely deet yourself up and cover up, because they are everywhere. Okay, so a little bit about Cousin Island itself. You can see there on the left, it's the typical, tropical island views: white sand, blue sky, blue oceans. So it actually used to be a coconut plantation. It became a nature reserve in 1968, specifically to protect the Seychelles warbler that could be found there. It is one of the world's first whole island and sea reserves, and at the moment it is managed by Nature Seychelles, who do a fantastic job. So the endemic species that we went to see on Cousin Island, we've got this one here, which is the Seychelles fody. Now, there's a current population size of about 2,300 mature birds, and on Cousin Island itself, there are about 500 to 600 pairs. It's only found on the islands in the Seychelles that are free from tree climbing rats. So as a result of that, boats are not actually allowed to moor on Cousin Island. So access is only via their own island speedboat transfer, which will come and pick you up from a boat and then do a beach landing, which is it's quite intense. It lands very fast. And the Seychelles phody in the Seychelles, it's only found on 6 of the islands. So Cousin Island, which is where we went, Cousin and Frigate, where they are naturally occurring. And then they've also been introduced and reintroduced on the islands of Daros, Dennis, and Aride as a safeguard for the population and to keep the numbers up. So here we've got on the left, that's the Seychelles magpie robin. That is the second endemic that we saw on Cousin Island. There is a current population size of 500 birds. Cousin Island itself has 66 birds at present from the latest count. In 1970, there were just 23 birds left in total. So these birds were translocated from Frigate Island and they were translocated to Cousin, Dennis, and Aride. They do actually allow a really close approach and they're often seen feeding in the leaf litter in the areas where the resident giant tortoises have disturbed the soil. So they're quite easy to get a close approach to. And then, of course, we have the Seychelles warbler, the reason that Cousin Island was designated as a nature reserve in the first place. Now, they are a huge conservation success story. They've gone from near extinction on just one tiny island, Cousin Island is tiny, to thriving on 5 islands now. So the population size at present is 3,000 birds. The last remnant population was Cousin Island, where at one point there were just 26 birds left in total. Now there are 320 birds on Cousin Island, and birds have been translocated to nearby Aride, Cousin, Dennis, and Frigate. So, as well as the 3 endemic land birds, Cousin Island is also a fantastic site for breeding seabirds. So, here we have the lesser noddy. 80,000 pairs breed on Cousin Island. Now, they nest exclusively in the Indian Ocean, so this was a new seabird species for us. Their nesting season is between April to October, which is the dry season in the Seychelles. And Cousin Island is one of the largest breeding sites for lesser noddies in the world. You can see they're very similar to brown noddies. They do have a much longer and thinner bill. Brown noddies were present on Cousin Island, but in a lot smaller numbers. We've got here white-tailed tropic birds, like we mentioned before. So they actually breed on Cousin Island. And you can get within a few feet of these birds as they nest next to the tree trunks, just like so. We were lucky enough to come across quite a few little chicks as well, dotted about while we were there. You can see there on the left, and on the right, you can just see the tropic birds kind of nestle in amongst the tree roots. They allow a really close approach. They're a ground nesting species, so again, they will nest in areas here. There's no predators for them, so there's about 3,000 pairs that actually breed on Cousin Island. Again, some of you might remember from our Hawaii tour, we've got the white tern. They breed on Cousin Island year round. Again, they allow a really close approach. There's about 4,000 pairs on Cousin Island. And I have to say, it's one of the best places that I've been to. You just kind of wander through the trees and there are seabirds all around you perched on the branches. They're not scared of you. It's fantastic. So it's something I would highly recommend. Apart from the birds on Cousin Island, there's also Aldabra giant tortoises. Now, they are native to Aldabra Atoll in the Seychelles, and they have been introduced to Cousin Island as well as the other granitic islands after overexploitation sadly led to the extinction of the resident species. So they are an important part of the ecosystem. Like I said, they will uncover food for the Seychelles magpie robins as they are walking about through the forest and disturbing the leaves. Now, we hired Angel Tours for the day as a private boat. So obviously Cousin Island is only open to visitors in the morning. So in the afternoon, we took a boat trip around Prowling Island and did a little bit of snorkeling. So this is St. Pierre Island, which is a very scenic, sort of famous part of the Seychelles, which is a good snorkeling spot in calm seas. Unfortunately, it was quite a windy day while we were there. So they took us to a place called Antalazio where we went swimming with hawksbill turtles. Now they are actually critically endangered as a species, and they're identified by their narrower face and beak that you can see compared to green turtles, which actually have a rounder face and head. We also saw a wealth of fish above the corals, and a shoal of flying fish as well while we were on the boat. So we did have an amazing time. So it is something that I would absolutely highly recommend doing if you do go to Cousin Island. Another point of note is as well, we booked via Angel Tours as a private boat because we had heard as well that sometimes people who'd booked onto a public tour, if they hadn't got enough numbers, the company was cancelling it at the last minute, and that's what's something that we wanted to avoid. So that's just something to think about.
Okay, so our next island was Ladigue. We decided to do a day trip there because our main focus was just for one species, which I'll speak about in a minute. So a day trip should be sufficient for what you need on Ladigue for the terms of the birds. Ladigue is the third most populated island. It has about a population of about 2,800 people, and the main mode of transport to get around is either on bike or on foot. So this was inside one of the nature reserves that we got to. It's very, very close to the port. I would say probably about 10-15 minute walk. It's home to the critically endangered Seychelles paradise flycatcher. We prioritised visiting the main nature reserve on the island in the hope that we could connect with this species. The primary use of the Verve Reserve, which is what it was called, is to provide a protected breeding and feeding habitat for the Seychelles paradise flycatcher. Ladigue is the main home to this beautiful flycatcher species where it lives, in the dense tropical woodland. Approximately 1,000 international visitors come to the reserve, with many with the primary objective to seek out a glimpse of this rare flycatcher. So here it is here. And it is a real beauty. And this was the reason why we came here. It was we had a few hours in the morning just to seek out this species. Now, we did a couple of loops around the reserve. The first loop that we did, we actually couldn't find this species until we met a couple of German tourists. And I don't think they were bird watchers in particular, but we asked them. We thought, oh, well, we'll see if they've seen any birds with long black tails. And lo and behold, they had photographed one on the way in on top of a wheelie bin, which, in honesty, we didn't expect because we'd been trudging around in the hot heat for about an hour looking for this species. But as you can see, the males feature glossy jet black plumage, beautiful long tail, and females charm with their chestnut brown feathers, making them an exquisite sight under the canopy. This is a forest dwelling bird is the second rarest species in the Seychelles. The population is about 350 individuals, and some birds have been taken from the most populated areas in Ladigue and relocated on a couple of smaller outer islands just to preserve and protect this species even further. As the name suggests, it does prey on insects in flight, and we were lucky enough to see it doing that, catching a few of the moths that were present under the canopy. But we were very, very lucky to see this species, and we spent a little bit of time with it. So we moved back to Pralin, and then again got another ferry over to Mahe, which is the largest island. We stayed at a place called Villa Kiki on the southwest side of the island, which has a stunning bay overlooking it. These were the views that we had from breakfast, and from our room and the hotel had a pair of breeding Seychelles kestrels on territory, plus numerous Seychelles blue pigeons providing regular flybys. White-tailed tropic birds also flew by, and we had lovely views of great crested terns that roosted on the sandbanks below. So going back to the Seychelles kestrel, this is the one Steff talked about, where on Pralin that we had one on the wires. The Seychelles kestrel is the smallest kestrel in the world, measuring a minimum of 18 centimeters in length. It's the only bird of prey in the Seychelles. There's around about 400 pairs now, with the majority located on Mahe. And despite the stable population trend, habitat is declining with urban development increasing. However, as seen in the UK with our own common kestrels, they are well known to adapting to this new environment. So on the Seychelles, on Mahe in particular, we are our one of our biggest aims was this species here, the Seychelles white-eye. As you can see on the right-hand side, I've just noted down the population trend declining from the last 20 or so years, and you can see it's quite alarming, really. Historically, the Seychelles white-eye had a healthy population across Mahe. This species is now on the brink of extinction here. For the last 80 years, the birds have been restricted to the uplands of Mahe, with extensive coverage of the island for perhaps hidden or unfound birds. Mahe has seen the sharpest declines, with the original population crashing to just 2 mature individuals in 2024. The known pair is still active now, luckily. However, following translocations to some other islands back in the day, the population remains critical but stable for the time being. So we hired a guide on this first day in Mahe, and he took us to the best location to see this Seychelles white-eye. Now, the previous day, we'd actually spent some considerable time looking for this bird, but we couldn't find it. So our hopes were all pinned on the guide. I'll speak about him in a minute. Again, we had lovely views of Seychelles swiftlet, as Steph mentioned before. They were a species that you couldn't really just aim for, but the guide did take us to a reservoir where it's usually a haven for swiftlets with the sharp cliffs around it coming down to drink and feed over the water. Native to Africa, the common waxbill is a self-sustaining introduced species to the island, which can surprisingly be difficult to see in localized numbers on here. So this was another one the guide took us to see whilst we had him for the day. The Seychelles blue pigeon, as Steph mentioned before, was quite a secretive bird. So we spent quite a lot of our time up until now looking and hoping for better photo opportunities. So despite it being a familiar sight across the main islands, we hadn't seen it particularly close up. So our guide Pearlie knew a location in a small park inside the capital, which was Victoria, and they showed really, really nicely. The afternoon took us to a more urban location here, where he guaranteed us views of this lovely bird. The critical endangered Seychelles stop owl, and this one's for Steve Cully, really. The range of the Seychelles stop owl was first described in 1880. After much habitat clearing, the introduction of animals such as rats and cats, and even barn owls, the population was crushed to the point where it's thought to be extinct by 1906. No further news on that species was heard or found until 1959, and it was rediscovered in a mountainous cloud forest. It wasn't until 2002, though, that the population estimate was made at around about just over 300 species. 300 individuals. Despite close monitoring, populations are declining, with over 200 individuals estimated 4 years ago. So Pearlie took us to a handful of likely locations, which we had the best chance to connect with this rare Scops owl. And after about 30 minutes, we heard it calling from within the forest. So after a little bit of persistence, we gained some beautiful views of this really critically endangered species. I just wanted to shout out as well for Pearlie. He was an excellent guide for the day. He took us around and delivered everything that we were hoping to see. So that really marked the end to a really successful trip to the Seychelles. A few extra species that we had along the way. We visited a few local estuaries, with this being one of them. Migrant waders are a common sight around the shores of the Seychelles, especially in August time, July, August, when they return from breeding further north. So approaching the end of July, many shorebirds were just about returning after breeding in Europe and Asia. We had Eurasian wimble, green shanks, turnstones, grey plovers, and even these beautiful crab plovers here. We had about 4 of those together. And of course, numbers will increase as the winter goes on, where they'll spend the winter in the much warmer climate. In addition to those, the seabirds, similar to what we saw on Hawaii, as Steph said, with the white terns and the frigate birds. The frigate birds are like pirates, or they're nicknamed pirates of the sky. They were often very common patrolling those skies, and lesser frigate birds were the main species during these summer months. You do get greater frigate birds that usually come inland to breed during our winter. Also, a surprising one was roseate tern. I think I'd spent a couple of days thinking these were common terns until I looked at them in a little bit more detail, and we had a couple of boat trips across to the other islands. We actually took a few photos and thought, actually, that's not quite a common. So after a little bit of information and a little bit of research, we actually realised that roseate tern was actually the common species in the Seychelles, which has made a nice change. Another little excursion that we did was a submarine trip that we did. We went on a semi-submarine trip from Eden Island onto the north coast, which takes you over to Ile-aux-Cerfs. It submerges you under the water, so you're at eye level with the corals and the fish. This is a great way to enjoy the underwater life in the Seychelles if you're not a confident snorkeler. It was really, really beautiful just to see many of the hundreds of different fish species that were around those waters, which we'll talk about in a later date under in this PowerPoint as well. The Seychelles cattle egret is basically a subspecies of the Western cattle egret, and this was really, really easy to see on Mahe. But it was quite common around the rubbish dumps. Luckily, I spotted a big flock of them on a big rubbish dump, and one of the local men let me inside to photograph them. So quite nice addition to the list. White-tailed tropic birds, one of my favourite species from Hawaii. We were really, really lucky to come across this familiar bird. And as Steph said, they were very, very common, just like seagulls are over here, with regular territories and regular movements always noted. As a keen bird watcher in North Wales, I love watching the sandwich terns, and often a tern out to sea usually grabs my attention. So we had some amazing encounters with great crested terns, and I noticed as I was driving around the Seychelles, little rocky outcrops just offshore usually had these great crested terns just roosting on a high tide. So as I was driving around, so happened that literally the other side of the barrier of the road was the sea, and on one of these rocks was a great crested tern here. So we literally stopped and held up the traffic just to get a couple of pictures of this lovely bird. And there you can see a typical view of the rocky outcrops just off the Seychelles beaches. Another non-bird highlight was the Seychelles pitcher plant. It's listed as least concern. This is an endemic carnivorous plant native to 2 of the Seychelles islands. They're believed to be around about 1,000 plants located in the upland cloud forests on 2 islands in the Seychelles. As you can see, they are beautiful, quite dramatic plants. The plant is a woody climber, has leathery type leaves. The leaves can grow up to about 25 centimeters long, and the plant produces a funnel shaped pitchers that can grow up to about 15 centimeters. The pitchers have lids and are filled with digestive enzymes. And obviously, this is what attracts flies and insects small animals, even like small frogs, to the actual plants to feast on inside. Okay, we then flew to Reunion. So Reunion is much further south. It was a couple of hours flight down to Reunion Island. Um, Again, this was a good opportunity to go and explore. It is a French territory. There are six surviving endemic bird species with Reunion in their name. And Reunion has a volcano that has erupted more than 100 times since 1640, which we didn't know until I started researching a little bit for this presentation. Luckily, it wasn't erupting when we were there. Reunion is a French overseas department with a population of about 900,000 people. With a approximate circumference of 207 kilometers, Reunion Island is slightly larger than the nearby Mauritius, but with half the population. Due to the particularly abundant marine wildlife, swimming, water sports, and diving are forbidden within a perimeter of 300 meters around the coastline. And sadly, the island hosts more species that have been declared extinct than there are currently endemic. So, starting off on Reunion, we went to a lovely local national park, and again, we were we were very, very lucky to have almost all of our species, our targets, at this national park. Although restricted to just the island of Reunion, the population is thriving with a maximum estimate of 50,000 Reunion grey white-eyes. They're a bit like the blue tits, the great tits. They had that kind of nature. They were just potter around in the trees, a little bit like gold crests. Um, as they move from branch to branch, very, very quick moving, hard to photo as well. The mascarene paradise flycatcher is very, very similar to a few flycatchers we've seen in Asia. And I know they have these species in Africa as well. It's a species is not considered vulnerable due to its healthy population in Reunion. However, it's a very different story on Mauritius. The reason being is because of the extensive native forest on Reunion, and it provides a basis for success with very few predators. The national park hosts all endemic species available in the upland tropical forest, along with a relatively short couple of kilometres of trail. The Reunion white-eye, a little bit less, the population is smaller than the grey white-eye that I've just shown you. And Reunion bulbuls, very, very similar to the Seychelles bulbul. And then in the middle, you got the Reunion harrier, which was recently split from the Madagascar harrier. We had good views of all three of those species in the reserve. And the Reunion shrike is endemic to Reunion. Males are mostly grey with black wings and black tail. Now, this was the main species that we came here for. Just to give you a little bit of info about this cuckoo shrike, it's critically endangered and scarily has a very, very small range of about 6.2 square miles of habitat that it lives in the entire world. The fears surrounding the entire population could be wiped out entirely in a tropical storm or a cyclone. So conservation efforts are in place to make sure that the control of rats and cats stabilize the population or increase it. So this was a real quest to try and find this bird. Upon arrival, we met a Dutch team who were really helpful. They gave us a few indications of where we were hoping to see them after themselves seeing the birds earlier in the morning. They gave us promising info, and it didn't take us long until we came across the iconic call of the male Reunion cuckoo shrike. If any of you have ever been to Lakenheath RSPB, it's like looking for a golden oriole in the poplar plantations. You could stand there for hours and just continue hearing the call without seeing that bright bird amongst the trees. So this was the same story here, really. After a couple of hours or so, the bird was varying in distance. It sounded miles away, and then it would come in quite close, then it'd move away again. And there was probably two individuals, two males calling, really. Steph acquired some brief glimpses of it about 2 hours in, but then I didn't. Unfortunately, she couldn't get me on it. It moved after she'd called the bird. After another 2 hours of looking, I eventually saw it and then agreed to have this photo taken, looking happier. But again, a lovely, lovely bird, but incredibly rare. So a real great addition to our trip. Keep maintaining our 100% record so far. Going from the rare to the common, there was reunion stone traps around in the car park as we pulled up. So another common and familiar sight to upland reunion, which is where they mainly inhabited. A small, chunky, robin-sized bird, really. Males are black and white, and they show some clear white eyebrow. Females are a little bit more plainer, they're a bit more drab, but very tame, and often showing down to a few feet. Now, along with the endemic, we also had some, we call them category seabirds, where they've been introduced. The main reason that the village weaver has been introduced was to add colour to the island, and it certainly does that. This bird is native to much of sub-Saharan Africa, and the birds, as the name suggests, weave their nests. They construct compact hanging woven nests, often hanging from large trees in large colonies in or around urban areas. It's also known that males will use their nests to attract females, and the females will judge the male on the condition and the quality of the nest. This is one of the nests that we found underneath one of the colonies that obviously come off. But as you can see, very, very nicely woven, very skilled. The Madagascar button quail is an interesting bird, actually. We weren't sure whether we'd see this species because button quails are quite renowned for being incredibly secretive and very elusive. Now, we're not really sure whether the Madagascar button quail is actually native to Reunion or not. Despite plenty of research, nobody really knows. So it's possible that it is native to Reunion, and it certainly is in Madagascar. But we do know that it was introduced to Mauritius, despite us not seeing it on Mauritius. I think the populations have died out, but they are still thriving in Reunion. So we did target this species next. We drove south to a reserve further south on the island. It is often seen alone or in small groups of up to 3 or 4 birds. If startled, it may crouch to avoid detection or may run away. But as witnessed, it rarely flew and it just ran, didn't it, really? But really, really nice species to see on one of the golf courses that we visited. Another introduced species was the red-billed quelea. Now, this you may have heard of before because it's actually one of the biggest and most numerous species on Earth, with an estimated 1.5 million individuals worldwide. They are native to Africa, sub-Saharan, and they were introduced to Reunion. The species are renowned for forming superflocks in their native lands. Up to 1 million birds can be seen up to, I think I've seen them on David Attenborough programs in the past, on the savannah and the plains. So really, really nice to see. And once we found the true flock, there was about 500 to 400 or 500 birds together. Mascarene swiftlet. So similar to the Seychelles swift, this was the regional endemic swiftlet to Reunion and Mauritius. So we saw this on both islands. We're seeing in good numbers across. They were originally thought to be a subspecies of the Seychelles swiftlet, and then in recent time they have been split and called one species. The dramatic coasts of Reunion, we didn't realise actually how dramatic the sea was around the coast, and you can see why they have a 300 metre range of no swimming around the coast, because not only is the for wildlife purposes, they can be incredibly deep and dangerous as well. We happened to arrive down in the south after a cyclone had been present offshore for a few days. So, unbeknown to us, we set up the scope and did a little bit of sea watching. And the sea watching was really alive during the time that we were there, um, where we witnessed hundreds of tropical shearwaters, which was a different subspecies of the tropical shearwater that we saw in the Seychelles. So, potentially a future split for us. We saw plenty of wedge-tailed shearwaters, brown and lesser noddies, and good numbers of white-tailed tropic birds, and also a uncommon brown skua. Now, we haven't got many pictures of those at all because of just how distant they were offshore. And to be honest, our eyes were glued to the scope most of the time because it was so busy. But this location is in the south, is world famous for acquiring sublime views of the Browse petrel. But this occurs in their breeding season, which is about mid-September to February. So, unfortunately, we were just that little bit too early for them, probably about 4 weeks too early to see these birds. This ended our trip in Reunion. We had spent 4 days here altogether, and then we flew back or over towards Mauritius. So, go through. Mauritius has a recorded total of 159 species of birds in total, including 10 of those which are endemic and available to us. Mauritius was formed a relatively young 9 million years ago, in comparison to Hawaii that we spoke to you about last year, which was about 500 million years ago. And they were formed through eruptions of underwater volcanoes. 3 nations have colonized Mauritius over the years, including the Netherlands, France, and the UK, and they have remained independent since 1968. Rodriguez Island is another island we did visit, which we'll speak to you about soon. And that was to the east of Mauritius by 583 kilometers. And it's home to a further 2 endemic species to that island. Obviously famous for the dodo, the flightless bird weighed about 23 kilograms and sadly proved to be a good source of fresh meat for the sailors who arrived in the 1500s. And unfortunately, by 1681, the dodo was claimed extinct. Only less than 2% of native forest now remains on Mauritius, contributing highly towards the huge declines across many native endemic species here.
Okay, so Mauritius. During our stay in Mauritius, we stayed in 3 locations in total. We stayed at La Hacienda and Fernie Nature Lodge, both of which were on the southeast of the island. We also stayed at Tamata Bel Ombre Resort as well on the south coast of the island. So this meant that we mainly explored the southern side of Mauritius. Outside the resorts and the hotels, it is very rural. So there are a lot of rice fields. It's not particularly well built up. So I would advise if you do go to Mauritius, don't plan on going outside to restaurants to eat at night or anything like that. Stay in your resorts and stay in your hotels. In comparison to Hawaii, Mauritius has actually been hugely successful in their conservation efforts of the native birds. The Mauritian Wildlife Foundation have done an absolutely phenomenal job of halting the declines of many of their endemic species there. I was very impressed by what they've done. And I have to say that there is some excellent snorkeling in Mauritius as well. If anybody's a keen snorkeler or interested in fish or anything like that, we had some crystal clear waters, and it was really interesting taking a lot of photos of the different fish that were knocking about and identifying those. So that was something that I took a little interest in while I was out there. Okay, so the main site to see virtually all of the endemics bar one in Mauritius is the Black River Gorges National Park. That is located on the southwest interior of Mauritius. We went on the Maccabee Trail while we were there. So you park at a place called Le Petrin Information Centre and you follow the trail up into the native woodland and trees. It's free to visit. It's the largest national park that is in Mauritius, and several areas have been fenced off to protect the area from invasive deers and wild pigs that can cause a threat to the native wildlife. So the first endemic is the Mauritius cuckoo shrike. There are 350 pairs of this bird, which is on the left in Mauritius, and there is a native population at Black River Gorges, which is what we went to see. There has been a reintroduced population as well for conservation purposes at Ferny Valley. Now, the Mauritius cuckoo shrike is very easy to pick up, like the Reunion cuckoo shrike, on their call, and we were lucky to get some really good views of this bird. Nowhere near as elusive as the Reunion cuckoo shrikes. We saw this within about 5 minutes of, well, 2 minutes of hearing it. So quite a contrast. All right, here we have on the bottom right, this is the Mauritius bulbul. Again, very similar to the Seychelles and Reunion bulbul. There are 560 mature individuals of this species on Mauritius, and again, a native population at the Black River Gorges National Park, and their population is stable. We afforded quite good views of the Mauritius cuckoo shrike, Mauritius bulbul. They were showing quite nicely in some of the car parks, so that was good to get some good views of those. Now, next up, we have the echo parakeet. You can see here that they are very similar to the ring-necked parakeets. Some of the main differences in identifying them are that the females actually have an all black bill as opposed to the red bill of the male. You can see here on the bird on the left, we think this was a young male, so it would have started off with a dark coloured bill and it's just starting to get its red coloration. Now, their call is also very different to ringneck parakeets as well, which are also present at Black River Gorges. So if you do see a flock flying over, it's the call is the main way to sort of identify them. Echo parakeets are one of the birds that the Mauritius Wildlife Foundation have focused on in their conservation efforts. In the 70s, there were just 20 birds left in Mauritius. Today, there are now over 700 birds, thanks to a very successful captive breeding program. And birds have been released from this captive breeding program in Ferny Valley and the nearby Chamarel Ebony Nature Reserve. So that was a really good species to come across. Next, we have the pink pigeon. Now, this is quite a famous bird if any of you have studied zoology. It's one of the world's rarest pigeons. In 1990, there were just 10 wild birds left. It is a famous conservation icon. Now there are over 600 wild birds on Mauritius, thanks to an intensive captive breeding program. And Jersey Zoo and the Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust played a key role in this, captive breeding the pink pigeons and sending them out for release. Now, as you can see here on the right-hand picture, we went to a pink pigeon release site, which was located at the Black River Gorges at Le Petrum. So they have a feeding station and release site there, and there are a ton of pink pigeons. Now, we were very careful while we were there, and we were looking out for birds that did not have rings on. So we found this bird here, which is unringed, which would indicate that it is a wild-born bird. They do have a lot of birds there. Obviously, every bird that they released has been rung, so they can identify them and keep track of them. They do have quite a bit of mortality with the pink pigeons as well through cars knocking them down. So we were really pleased to come across this individual here that would appear to be a wild-born bird. Here we have the Mauritius grey white-eye, again quite similar to the Reunion grey white-eye. Now, this was a very common bird across Mauritius, found in most of the areas where there were trees present, including any of the resorts, and it was really easy to find them. We picked them up by call. They are a cute little bird that it was lovely to see in good numbers while we were there. Now, another part of the Black River Gorges National Park is a place called Bassin Blanc. Now, this is basically a lay-by which is overlooking a large lake, which is quite unassuming, but it's actually a great spot for some of the endemic species. So the main one that we went there to see is the Mauritius olive white-eye, which you can see there on the right. This is the rarest of the Mauritian endemics, and it is only found at Black River Gorges. There are just 150 wild birds left, and as a result of their low numbers, they have also been introduced at Ebony Forest nearby and an island called Île aux Aigrettes as a sort of safeguarding measure. It was quite hard to see this bird. We did visit 3 times and we did see them on all 3 occasions, but they were very hard work, and we only got sort of, say, about a minute or so glimpse of this species as they kind of passed by before doing, I presume, a circuit around the lake. Now, they're actually in decline for a number of reasons due to habitat loss from land clearing for plantations and also predation from introduced species such as black rats and crab-eating macaques, which is a type of primate that raid their nests. Um, so predator control and habitat restoration is key to halt their declines. Another species that we saw on Mauritius, and one of my favourite birds of the trip, is the Mauritius fody. Now, again, they can only be found at Black River Gorges, where about 220 birds are present. They have been released, like the Mauritius olive white-eye, on Île aux Aigrettes, where they have 300 birds. And they are very similar to the red fody that I mentioned earlier, that was on the Seychelles, which is also present all across Mauritius. The red fody there on the right, Mauritius fody on the left. And you can see that the main difference in identifying these two species is actually the shape and the size of the bill. You can see it is much longer, thinner, and more curved in the Mauritius fody on the left, as opposed to the kind of thick, stumpy, and triangular bill of the red fody on the right. But, you can appreciate as well that a passing glimpse that is very sort of, easy to get the two mixed up. So we did have to look closely. And a little interesting thing about this bird as well is we were in the car park and I was actually wearing a bright red raincoat at the time, which I think this particular male seemed to like, and it actually followed me around the car park for about an hour, singing its head off to wherever I went in the car park. It just seemed to pop up and show again and start singing. So a tip to anybody looking for Mauritius fodies is wear a bright red raincoat. So I mentioned Île aux Aigrettes, which is where some of the birds have been released. It is a small island in the southeast of Mauritius, and you can book a tour across via a boat. We opted for the VIP tour, which is a private tour where the guide will just take you around and will basically go wherever you like and look for whatever you are after. Now, it actually became a nature reserve in 1965. It's had a variety of uses in the past. The Dutch, the French, and the British have all occupied it. It is made up of coralline limestone, and it was mostly deforested during the time of occupation. But it's actually home to the last remnants of dry coastal forest on Mauritius, which were once found across the coast. So the Dutch deforested the island to export ebony wood, or black gold as it is known. But a restoration project was launched in the 1980s to restore the island's original ecosystem. And the Mauritius Wildlife Foundation have used Île aux Aigrettes as kind of a safeguarding location for some of these rare species where they translocated them. And it also offers a chance to see the endemic birds up close. All of them are ringed. There are various bird feeders situated in the forest to view the species. You can only visit as part of a guided tour, like I said. But it has Mauritius olive white-eyes, Mauritius fodies, and pink pigeons that you can get really good looks of. But it is an important backup location for these rare endemics, so they are using it as conservation purposes. So here's the pink pigeon that we saw there. You can see it's ringed. Again, a ringed Mauritius olive white-eye. And the Mauritius fodies, again, like I just spoke about, they're hanging about the feeders. And Île aux Aigrettes also has a plant nursery as well on site to propagate endemic and rare plant species to help reforest the areas. Now, as Alex mentioned, there's the Masserine Paradise Flycatcher. It's currently the same species as on Reunion, but it may be split in the future. It's a different subspecies. And it is much rarer and much harder to find on Mauritius. We really struggled to find this bird in Black River Gorges National Park. It is present there, but we just could not hear or come across any species. So we actually opted to visit a nature reserve in the far north of Mauritius called Brastou. It took a long time to find them even there. And the one that we did come across was typically at the very end of the trail after we'd been walking for about 2 hours trying to search them out. But we were really pleased to come across this species in case it is split in the future. So Mauritius as well, like I mentioned, had absolutely beautiful crystal clear waters. So we did take a glass bottom boat and snorkeling tour at the Blue Bay Marine Park down in the south coast of Mauritius. The visibility was fantastic and there is a huge range of fish on the corals. So it is something that I would highly recommend. If you're not interested in snorkeling, it is a glass bottom boat as well, so you can see the corals as well without getting in the water. So that was something that I would recommend doing. So Fernie Nature Lodge. This is another of the hotels that we stayed at and is situated in the beautiful Fernie Valley. It's the only location on Mauritius for the truly wild Mauritius kestrels. And I actually booked the kestrel suite. There was a choice of 4 birds that you could choose from. And I chose the kestrel, hoping it would bring us luck finding some Mauritius kestrels while we were there. And while the chap was actually checking us in, he asked us if we needed anything else, and I just asked him on the off chance if he knew where to find Mauritius kestrels, sort of fully expecting him to give a generic answer that he didn't really know about birds or they could be anywhere. But much to my surprise, he explained that he sees them perch in the large tree next to the main lodge every morning, so that he was quite confident we would see them. So, Mauritius kestrel, it is the national bird of Mauritius. They actually breed in Fernie Valley in very good numbers. You can see here on the bottom right, there's a little nest box that is occupied with a little kestrel peeking out there, eating a gecko. And that was actually on this tree here on the left-hand side of my picture on the left, the dead tree there, which was by the reception of the lodge. So they have got nest boxes set up throughout the valley, including around the main lodge area. So the Mauritius kestrel is a huge conservation story for Mauritius. It's quite a famous case as well. So in 1974, there were just four known birds left, including just a single breeding female. It is a world conservation icon, and it is recognised as the most successful animal recovery programme in the world. So from 4, there are now 250 to 300 birds. So kestrels were actually in decline due to habitat loss and DDT pesticide use in Mauritius, alongside predation of chicks by invasive species such as rats, cats, and mongooses. So that is how they got in such a desperate situation. At the moment, there are 2 main populations of Mauritius kestrel on the island. The eastern population at Fernie Valley, which is the birds that we saw. So they are currently doing well and they are stable with around 50 pairs. There's also the western population at Black River Gorges that isn't doing quite as well. In fact, an island-wide survey in 2007 showed a drastic reduction in numbers of the kestrels across the island from 600 birds down to around 325. So the factors that contributed to this latest decline in the eastern population is actually unclear. So they have done some things to try and remedy it. They've put more predator-proof nest boxes installed at Black River Gorges, as the birds are found to breed more successfully when boxes are provided. Captive reared birds have also been released at Ebony Forest, at Belle Ombre, and at Black River Gorges from eggs which have been harvested from the Fernie Valley population. So because they're doing so well, they're able to harvest the eggs from the kestrels. Once they take the eggs, the kestrels will often go on to have a second brood, so it doesn't impact them, but they're then able to rear the birds and release them, which they have done at those sites, Ebony Forest, Belle Ombre, and Black River. So obviously the Mauritius kestrels, despite all this work, they are in decline. Serious efforts will be needed to be invested in the coming years to truly safeguard them from extinction. So they are a priority species for the Mauritius Wildlife Foundation, but they've done a phenomenal job getting to where they are with these kestrels. So it really is something to be applauded. And I do think they were one of the standout highlights of the trip. This bird in particular here was one of the 2 birds that perches in the tree next to Fernie Lodge. It hangs about the car park. You can get some really fantastic views. So it's something that I would definitely recommend doing if you do go to Mauritius. After we'd stayed in Fernie Lodge, we went to Tomasa Belle Ombre Resort. It was a beautiful resort on the southern part of the island. By this point, we'd sort of done all of our main birding. We'd seen all of our target species. So it was quite nice to relax and just enjoy the resort. Excellent food, breakfast, a fantastic house reef for snorkeling, and it was all surprisingly very, very affordable. However, we didn't stop birding. There were Masserine martins present at the hotel, and we had excellent views because they were breeding around the resort. So we actually had our best views of the trip here as they perched on top of the parasols. We did find that they were hard to find elsewhere on Mauritius, and we only really saw them sporadically elsewhere. So it was really nice to get these, up close views of them at the resort. So we did some snorkeling as well at the house reef, like I mentioned. This was great. It's just a few meters from the shore, but we had an absolutely fantastic range of fish there. You can see we've got a Picasso fish, box fish, and there are a lot of species of wrasse as well, all different colours. Alex found an eel and a flatfish, so it's something definitely worth exploring. We also visited the nearby world of Seychelles, which was actually fantastic. It was nearby and really fascinating. It holds a collection of seashells from all across the world, including some razor clams from Wales. So there were some local shells there. So they did have some beautiful collections of these really unusual seashells about 5 minutes away. So that was definitely worth going to see. Some of the wildlife as well on Mauritius here, like the Seychelles, we've got the Mauritius flying fox. They're abundant throughout sort of Mauritius, especially around the forested areas and at Ferny Valley and at the resorts. And on the bottom right, we've got the introduced crab-eating macaques, which is one of the animals which can cause a problem as a predator to the nest, like I mentioned with the Mauritius fody and the olive white-eye. So that's the culprit down there, looking mischievous on the wires.
Okay, in between our stay in Mauritius, we decided to get a flight to Rodrigues. It's about 580 kilometers northeast of Mauritius, and the island's not very big, 18 kilometers long and 8 kilometers wide. Rodrigues is very mountainous. We arrived in the pouring rain with many valleys and small hills. There's 2 endemic species of bird that we came here for, and 7 bird species declared extinct on here, including a solitaire not too dissimilar to the famous dodo. One thing worth mentioning, though, is that we were used to carrying around everywhere we went with the larger flights from Dubai to the Seychelles to Reunion and Mauritius with 23 kilograms each. We were only allowed 15 kilograms here, so we had or 15 kilograms between us, actually. So we had to leave quite a bit in Mauritius. So luckily, one of our hotels was able to keep our bags safe until we returned. Now, we did just over 24 hours. We had one night on Rodrigues just to provide a bit of short stay, really. And our main target was the Rodrigues fody and the Rodrigues warbler. We stayed at Utemps de Tang in the center of the island. It was a lovely flight in, seeing all the reef around us as we flew into the island. And our accommodation was excellent as well, where breakfast was supplied. So, Mauritius Wildlife Fund have done a fantastic job at preserving the remaining endemic flora and fauna. The Rodrigues fody is the main species that we came to see here. Once abundant on the island, the bird was nearly driven to extinction, with around about 5 or 6 pairs remaining in 1968. Due to conservation efforts, its numbers rose to around 1,000 individuals by 1999. The main threat to this species was the destruction of its forest habitat. The forest was cleared for farming and livestock, and the birds also compete. There were also birds introduced that were also competing with it, such as the red fody. We connected with this species very quickly at 2 target sites, which was Mount Lemon and Solitude Forest. Massive conservation efforts by the Mauritian Wildlife Fund have included reforestation, the main cause of the increase in fody numbers to this date. Simple actions such as erecting fences to keep out livestock have also proved successful. These were beautiful birds. This is the young male, just acquiring its beautiful yellow-orange plumage. And as it was just before the breeding season. It was just about to adapt its summer plumage of the orange yellow, which is expected to build up as the summer itself goes on. The Rodriguez warbler similar to the threatened Seychelles warbler that we saw early in the trip. This was a bird that was considered extinct after a cyclone in 1968. They believed it almost wiped out the population entirely, but luckily it was rediscovered a few years later in the 1970s, only for another cyclone in 1979 to reduce the work and the population once more. This prompted a huge response for the Mauritian Wildlife Foundation to conserve its efforts to support the remaining birds left on the island. And now, to date, there are many, many thousands of these individuals on the island. Again, another prime example of the Wildlife Foundation really doing its best.
Now, as Alex said, on Rodriguez, a lot of the flora and fauna has come under threat, especially being an island nation. So this one here, this is the Rodriguez flying fox. It was once the rarest bat in the world, and anyone who's been to Chester Zoo and the Twilight Zone will have come across these bats flying above your head. They are the giant ones that are in there. In the 70s, there were just 70 Rodriguez flying foxes left in the world. Now there are over 20,000 bats on Rodriguez. So this is due to successful breeding programs, which have been established across the world, as well as reforestation and long-term environmental education programs, school visits, events, and campaigns around the bats. So people are now learning to live alongside them, protect them, and care for them. Now, the bats are important on Rodriguez as seed dispersers and pollinators, and they are in turn also helping to recreate a forest that was once lost. So they are a fantastic species to see there. Another species as well is the Aldabra giant tortoise. This is the same one that we saw on Cousin Island. Rodriguez once held the highest density of land tortoises to have ever existed on the Earth, and it took humans just 100 years to cause the two native species on Rodriguez to become extinct. They were hunted for meat and oil in the 1700s. Now, this is the Aldabra giant tortoise. It is native to the Seychelles. Like I said, it's the same species that was on the Seychelles and Mauritius. They have brought the tortoises onto Rodriguez as they are an important part of the ecosystem there. They help native forest trees germinate, and they also actually limit forest fires as well by feeding on the grass and dry leaves. So that means that there's nothing to burn. So it was great to get close to the tortoises on the reserve, and they did enjoy having a little chin tickle, as you can see me there in the bottom right. Now, just some other examples of some great conservation success stories as well that are not necessarily birds on Rodriguez, but are still just as interesting. So we have here the lily-flowered hibiscus on the bottom left, which was actually propagated from just 3 remaining plants. And we have over here on the right the wild coffee or Café Marron, which I actually find absolutely fascinating. There was a guide that we met on Rodriguez when we went to the reserve, and I happened to mention that we lived about 20 minutes away from Chester Zoo. And of course, because Chester Zoo have done a lot of conservation work over in Rodriguez, he was very, very excited and offered to give us a guided tour of the reserve personally himself. And he showed us this wild coffee, which was absolutely fascinating. It's a really interesting story that shows that perseveration really does pay off. It was presumed extinct until 1980, when a school teacher just happened to hand out copies of a drawing of wild coffee to his class. And one of the schoolboys actually raised his hand and said, "Oh, I have one of these growing outside my house." Of course, they didn't believe him, but samples were taken and sent off to Kew, which miraculously confirmed that it was indeed a wild coffee and was in fact the last Rodriguez coffee plant in the world. So cuttings were propagated, successfully rooted, and even flowered, but they just could not get it to set seed or self-pollinate. So it actually took them over 20 years until the mystery was eventually solved. And they found out that warmer growing conditions allowed the plant to produce both male and female flowers. So the female flowers occurred later on in the growing season. This then meant they were able to self-pollinate the plant, and as a result, 100 viable seeds were produced, which germinated and established successfully. So now they've grown those on. They've got 1,000 seeds were eventually produced, and these are now growing throughout Rodriguez and on the reserve. It's a fascinating story. Equally as interesting as well, the young seedlings actually have brown lance-shaped leaves. And it isn't until later on that the plants morph into their adult form with the white flowers and the round green leaves that you can see there. That's actually an adaptation to protect them from the giant tortoises, which are attracted to the bright green leaves of the adult plant, but they are oblivious to the dull brown thin leaves of the seedlings. And the plant remains in this form while they are at grazing height of the tortoises and only morphs into its, the beautiful white flowers and leaves once they're tall enough to be out of marauding tortoises' range. But I was absolutely fascinated by these coffee plants when the guide was showing us, they're so rare, and it really does show as well that it's a reminder to keep trying if all hope does seem to be lost. So thank you very much for listening. As you can see, we even managed to find a dodo on our trip, even though they are classed as extinct. We welcome any questions, and I hope you enjoyed the talk.
Thank you very much.
Oh, diolch yn fawr, both of you. That was fantastic. As we imagined it might be, given last year's very successful talk, this was equal to it without any doubts. I'm sure there'll be some questions for you both. So please ask them outright, or if we've got any in the chat section, I'm sure Gary will remind me to ask those on your behalf. Whilst we're waiting, can I just ask you perhaps to explain a little bit more about the Mauritius Wildlife Foundation? Because it is extraordinary what they have achieved. You seem to be mentioning them pretty well every other sentence and every other species. Can you just say a little bit more about their status, how it's funded, and
Yeah, so the Mauritius Wildlife Foundation, I suppose they're the Mauritius equivalent to, say, the RSPB or other conservation organisations that we have here in the UK. They do partner with a lot of organisations as well. Like I say, Chester Zoo has played a phenomenal role in a lot of these conservation projects. So they are funded by the Mauritius government as well, and they are a charitable organisation. Like I say, they work with a lot of partners. Chester Zoo, I think Philadelphia Zoo, Jersey Zoo, with the captive breeding, and they do a lot of monitoring on the island. So they are a fantastic organisation, and they've done an absolutely phenomenal job for such a small island nation as well. They've really, it would be so easy for them to just think, oh, if it goes extinct, it goes extinct. But they've absolutely done a phenomenal job in actually really caring, really doing something to try and stop that, which compared to Hawaii, which when you think has got the whole backing of the United States behind it, Mauritius has done such a good job.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you both. That's really explained it very clearly. Yeah. Thank you. Right. Any other questions? Steve, you normally have one up your sleeve. Any?
Yeah, thank you very much. Fantastic talk as ever. You were saying the links to Chester Zoo, because I remember in the 1990s they were breeding the Mauritius kestrels then, so I managed to see them. And I don't know if you know Roger Wilkinson. He's a older birder. He was at Chester Zoo then, and I think I'm not sure if they had links with Jersey Zoo, and that's but all the birds, I think they've all gone back to Mauritius now to be. But it blows me away how many of the species got so critically endangered. Like with the kestrel, there was 4 birds and one female. So were there no others in captivity at that point? Was that the world population?
I think that was wild birds.
Oh, right.
So
okay.
there was 4 wild birds left, but I don't think they had that many in captivity as well. So obviously they took all those birds in, and obviously you've got genetic bottlenecks as well. So if you only have 4 birds, the genetic diversity is really poor. So to get from that to 600 is they've done a remarkable job, to be honest.
It's a similar situation to what we've seen on the Seychelles with the Seychelles white-eye. We're down to 2 wild left birds on the main island, and I think prior, obviously, to this, they've done a little bit of done a little bit of prep beforehand to make sure there's birds in captivity, there's birds on other outer laying islands to kind of bolster the populations before they start introducing them maybe in the future back to Mahe itself. It may well happen. So 30, 40 years time, we could see the population return after they've gone extinct or the native population's gone extinct there.
I think it's interesting as well because there's a place called, I think it was Conception Island, which is off Mahe, and they actually discovered that actually had a really healthy population of the Seychelles white-eyed. I think there's about 200, but in the space of like 5 years, they actually let them become extinct on the island. So they found them. I thought, oh, 200 of these, great, and then just let them. Happen. They just went extinct. And we're not on the island anymore.
Yeah. And what was the island where the magpie robins were in the Seychelles?
Cousin Island. So there's a few that sound similar. There's Cousin Island with no E on the end, Cuisine Island, which is right next to it with an E on the end, and then Curious Island, which is a little bit further north.
Yeah.
So if you do go to the Seychelles, Cousin Island is the one that you absolutely want to go to.
Okie dokie. Thank you.
Alex and Steff, can I ask, are there any efforts to get rid of any of the major predators like the crab-eating macaque?
Not that we'd come across. I think their main sort of ammo is breed the birds, put them on an island where there's no predators, and they'll be safe there. I think that's kind of, but I mean, they are trying predator control. The fences, and they've got predator-proof nest boxes for the kestrels as well, so the macaques can't get in the nest boxes. Compared to the kestrels, we're kind of trying to breed on the cliffs, sort of, or sort of naturally. So they are looking into that, but I'm not sure if they're trying to cull the macaques or anything like that. I'm not sure.
Not sure.
I mean, we didn't come across that many of them. We only saw one, and that was by like a Hindu temple. We didn't actually see any of the macaques in the forest, but they had fenced like the Black River Gorges off, so they do manage that area.
Very good, thank you.
Okay, so it's not a question, but Sue says thank you for such a comprehensive insight into that region. And Robin's asking, how long did you go for?
Oh, I think it was 3.5 weeks. I mean, we obviously spent a lot more time there than you would need to if it was just purely birding. Like I say, on Prawlin, we literally saw all the endemic species there within like a morning. So it's somewhere that you can see things really easily if you want to do it as part of a family holiday, and condense it down. We just spent so long there just for a bit of relaxation time and just to enjoy ourselves, really.
The main cost was getting there, wasn't it?
Flights,
actually, the hotels and a lot of the travel, the hire cars weren't particularly expensive. So once you were there, it was fairly cost efficient.
Any more questions? Okay. Well, if there aren't, Steff and Alex, I'm going to give you a vote of thanks. But before I forget, I must just mention two things, because I perhaps at the beginning incorrectly suggested that the Llŷn chuff count is this coming weekend. It's not. Julian has reminded me that it's on March the 8th, and apologies for my mistake there. And if you want to take part in the Llŷn chuff count, they do need some extra counters. Please contact Hannah Smith at the RSPB, and email her on hannah.smith@rspb.org.uk. She'd be really pleased to hear from you. So thank you. Right. Well, that was brilliant. I mean, just like last time when you talked about Hawaii, what I really loved was your insight into the whole ecosystem and the effect of history, and lots of other changes that are taking place. And that was great. And I love the way you bring in botany all the time, being a botanist. That was wonderful. Not just that sort of getting back to forest again, but although interesting individual species story. And I'm really looking forward to looking for the Cafe Moron next week when I go down to Kew to see firsthand how they've managed that amazing turnaround. But that's vital and it's fundamental. and I think get the habitat right and the plants right, and other things follow. And you showed that with several of the species and made the point really soundly and emphatically. And clearly, the Mauritius Wildlife Foundation recognizes the importance of that. And that's the foundation for a lot of their work. But over and above that, there is, as you've pointed out, the critical, time-consuming commitment to individual species conservation that is needed, but with such rewards. And it was just remarkably uplifting, far more so in Hawaii.
Yeah.
And as you say, all undertaken really by a relatively small foundation, conservation foundation, but leading to such great rewards. It's hard to imagine another part of the world where there's such a concentration of critically endangered species, and most of which are showing a turnaround. And for that reason alone, really well worth our attention. I'm minded to ask you, in a sense, how much conservation tourism is important now to these islands, from the fact you were there, and presumably many of the guides you used are used to taking people like yourselves around. It's important. I certainly hope so, because the islands certainly deserve to be rewarded in that way with tourism of the right sort, and long may that continue. And long may all those conservation programs continue, and that we continually learn from them, from their triumphs and from their mistakes as well. So, yes, another great talk from you both. It's wonderful that folk like you tour the world, come back having learned so much, and are so willing to convey your experience as tours. We're infinitely grateful to you both, and really hope you'll continue doing it for a long time to come. And then, with your feet firmly grounded back here in North Wales, you continue to turn up great birds and enthuse other people about our native avifauna. But just shows you the world's a wonderful place, and you visited what can only really be described as the Indian Ocean's equivalent to the Galapagos, because as an evolutionary basis for species diversification, it was fantastic. And thank you for pointing it out. So thanks for all your efforts in putting so many wonderful slides together. It was visually as well as informatively a real treat. And I'm sure I speak for everybody in that sense. Thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you for
Bye-bye.
having us.
Yeah.